Have you ever wondered what it would take to completely wipe out life on Earth? I mean, truly erase almost everything that crawls, swims, flies, or grows? It's actually happened before. Not once, not twice, but 5 separate times in our planet's history, and somehow, against all odds, life found a way back every single time. Today, we're diving deep into the most catastrophic events our planet has ever witnessed. Events so devastating, they literally rewrote the rules of existence. We're talking about mass extinctions, moments when the Earth essentially hit the reset button on biology itself. But here's the thing that'll blow your mind. These weren't just endings. They were beginnings in disguise. If you've ever felt like the world is fragile, like everything could change in an instant, well, you're absolutely right. And the proof is written in stone, literally. Every layer of rock beneath your feet tells a story of life rising up, thriving for millions of years, and then vanishing almost overnight. But it also tells another story, one of incredible resilience and renewal. So buckle up, because we're about to explore 5 epic disasters that make every Hollywood apocalypse movie look like a gentle summer breeze. And trust me, by the end of this series, you'll never look at a fossil the same way again. Now, before we jump into these ancient catastrophes, let me paint you a picture of what we're actually talking about when we say mass extinction. This isn't your typical bad day for a few unlucky species. We're talking about planetary-scale devastation, where at least 75% of all life forms disappear in what's essentially a geological heartbeat. Imagine walking through a vibrant city, bustling with millions of people, then returning the next day to find it almost completely empty. That's the scale we're dealing with, except instead of people, it's entire branches of the tree of life getting chopped off at once. But here's where it gets really interesting. Extinction isn't unusual at all. It's happening constantly, quietly humming along in the background like white noise. Scientists call this the background extinction rate, the natural rhythm of species appearing and disappearing as environments shift and evolution does its thing. Under normal circumstances, maybe a handful of species go extinct every 1,000 years. That's just nature's way of keeping things fresh. Mass extinctions are different. They're like sirens blaring through this quiet background hum. They're sudden, loud, and absolutely devastating. And the crazy part? Scientists don't study these events by looking at calendars or clocks. They read them like stories written in stone. Think of sedimentary rocks as Earth's personal diary, with each layer capturing a snapshot of what life was like when it formed. Sometimes these layers are packed with fossils, a rich variety of creatures that once called our planet home. But then suddenly, you hit a layer that's almost empty. The diversity just drops off a cliff. It's like turning a page in a colorful book only to find the next page is nearly blank. That sharp boundary is how we know a mass extinction occurred. And it's not just about what's missing. The rocks themselves tell tales through tiny chemical clues. A spike in certain rare metals might hint at an asteroid impact. Changes in carbon isotopes can signal massive volcanic eruptions that poison the atmosphere. All these signals come together like pieces of a cosmic puzzle, revealing that Earth didn't just lose a few species here and there, it lost nearly everything. So far, we've identified 5 major mass extinctions in Earth's history. each one unique in its cause and consequences. There's the Ordovician extinction, when most of life was still confined to the oceans, and a sudden ice age drained the shallow seas. Then came the Devonian extinction, a slow burn catastrophe that crept in over millions of years, systematically dismantling ancient reef systems and early fish communities. But the third one, oh man, the third one was the big one. The Permian Triassic extinction, sometimes called the Great Dying, nearly ended life's story entirely. We're talking about losing over 90% of marine species and 70% of life on land. It was the closest Earth has ever come to becoming a sterile rock floating through space. After that came the Triassic extinction, which cleared the stage for dinosaurs to rise and dominate the planet for over 100 million years. And finally, the most famous of all, the Cretaceous extinction, marked by that massive asteroid impact that ended the age of dinosaurs and paved the way for mammals to inherit the Earth. Some scientists believe we're currently witnessing the Sixth Mass Extinction, driven not by asteroids or volcanoes, but by human activity, habitat destruction, climate change, pollution, the works. But we'll dive deeper into that later in this series. What's absolutely mind-blowing is that these mass extinctions weren't just moments of destruction. They were turning points, full stops in Earth's story that forced completely new chapters to begin. Every time life got knocked down, what came back looked totally different. It's like evolution got a chance to completely reimagine what was possible. Sometimes we think of extinction as failure, like a species couldn't keep up with the game. But looked at from another angle, it's something else entirely. It's a reset, a chance for life to explore entirely new possibilities. Mass extinctions cleared the playing field, yes, but they also made space for innovations that never could have emerged otherwise. Wings, flowers, complex brains, all of these evolutionary marvels emerged in the aftermath of catastrophe. Now, if we want to understand how life nearly vanished from Earth multiple times, we need to learn how to read the planet's hidden archives, because the evidence isn't written in books or carved in monuments. It's pressed gently into stone, layer by layer, over hundreds of millions of years. Geology is basically Earth's memory system, a quiet but incredibly durable record that preserves everything from births to disasters to recoveries, even when all the surface details have long since vanished. And like any good archive, it's not always easy to interpret at first glance. You need to know what you're looking for and how to listen with your eyes. Those sedimentary rocks I mentioned earlier, the ones formed from compressed mud, silt, and sand, they're like pages in this massive planetary diary. Each layer captures what the world was like when it formed. Maybe it was a peaceful shoreline, a deep ocean floor, or a lush forest. Sometimes these layers preserve tiny shells, ancient pollen, or bones from creatures that lived millions of years ago. Sometimes they hold nothing at all, just empty space where life should have been, but wasn't. When scientists want to understand these ancient catastrophes, they start by slicing down through time, studying cross-sections of Earth that reach hundreds of millions of years into the past. They're looking for sudden changes, places where a layer rich with fossils is followed by one that's strangely barren. The fossils don't gradually fade away like you might expect. They stop abruptly, and that absence speaks louder than any preserved bone ever could. But it's not just about what's missing. It's about what remains. Certain minerals and chemical traces stick around long after the life itself has disappeared. Carbon isotopes, for example, work like bookmarks in the rock record. When life is abundant and healthy, the balance between different types of carbon looks one way. When massive die-offs happen, when photosynthesis stalls and oceans go stagnant, that balance shifts dramatically, leaving behind a chemical fingerprint of collapse. Other clues hide in the colors and composition of the rocks themselves. A layer rich in iridium, a rare metal more common in asteroids than on Earth, points to an impact event. Bands of black shale suggest stagnant, oxygen-poor seas. Volcanic ash layers loaded with sulfur or mercury hint at eruptions so massive they literally change the color of the sky. All these signs build a timeline not just of what happened, but when it happened. From the deep ocean sediments of the Ordovician period nearly 450 million years ago, to the coal-rich swamps of the Carboniferous, to the dinosaur-filled layers of the Cretaceous. Geologic time isn't measured in minutes or days. It's measured in rock layers, in sediment, in silence. Because silence in geology is never just emptiness. It's a space where life used to be and then wasn't. It's where an entire forest once stood, now reduced to a thin smear of clay. It's where a coral reef once thrived, now replaced by a dull gray line in the rock record. And when these silences appear not just once, but repeatedly across different continents and different types of rock, they start to form a pattern. Scientists call it the extinction rhythm. Sudden drops in biodiversity followed by strange new life forms appearing, then long quiet periods, and eventually another drop. It's not a perfect cycle, not clockwork, but it's definitely a rhythm. Each pulse marks a moment when Earth changed its mind about what kinds of life it would allow to flourish. Some changes came slowly and subtly, building pressure over millions of years. Others hit like lightning strikes, reshaping the entire planet in geological moments. But all of them are recorded here, deep below the surface, waiting to be pieced together like clues in the ultimate cold case. And as we follow these rock layers upward through more recent geological ages, we start to see how each extinction didn't just end one chapter of Earth's story. It set the stage for something completely new to take its place. The survivors weren't necessarily the strongest or the smartest. They were often the most adaptable, the most flexible, the ones who could make the best of whatever weird new world emerged from the ashes. This is where our story really begins to get interesting, because we're about to travel back to the very first of these great planetary catastrophes. We're going to journey nearly 500 million years into the past, to a time when life was just beginning to figure out how to exist, and witness how it almost didn't make it at all. To understand Earth's first great dying, we need to journey back to a world so alien it might as well be another planet entirely. Picture this: no grass beneath your feet, no trees casting shadows, no birds singing in the sky. The land is mostly barren rock swept by silent winds, carrying gases that would choke us instantly. But beneath the waves, that's where the real action was happening. Welcome to the Ordovician period, roughly 444 million years ago. This was Earth's first attempt at creating a truly complex biosphere, and it was almost entirely aquatic. Warm, shallow seas lapped against low-lying continents, and these waters were absolutely teeming with life forms that would look like aliens to us today. Imagine swimming through these ancient oceans. You'd encounter trilobites scuttling across the seafloor like armored tanks with compound eyes, some as small as coins, others the size of dinner plates. Nautiloids cruised through the water column like living torpedoes, their shells coiled in perfect spirals, some growing to massive proportions, with shells longer than a person is tall, and everywhere you looked there'd be brachiopods and bryozoans creating underwater gardens, filter feeding in the gentle currents. The sea floor itself was a bustling metropolis of coral-like creatures building the world's first great reef systems. These weren't the corals we know today, but entirely different organisms that had figured out how to construct massive limestone cities beneath the waves. Crinoids swayed like underwater flowers, their stalks anchored to the bottom, while their feathery arms filtered nutrients from the passing water. This was life's first real experiment with complexity, with building intricate food webs and specialized ecological relationships. For millions of years, it seemed like this underwater paradise could last forever. The climate was warm, the seas were stable, and evolution was having a field day creating new and wonderful forms. But then something started to change, and it began in the most unlikely place imaginable. Far from the thriving oceans, at the very edges of the atmosphere itself, temperatures began to drop. Not dramatically at first, just a subtle cooling that might have gone unnoticed, but this was the beginning of something catastrophic. The southern supercontinent called Gondwana had been slowly drifting across the globe, and now it was settling over the South Pole. As it did, something remarkable and terrible began to happen. Snow started falling, and instead of melting each season, it began to accumulate, layer upon layer, year after year, until vast ice sheets began spreading across the land like a slow-motion avalanche of frozen water. Now here's where things get really interesting from a physics standpoint. As these ice sheets grew, they didn't just sit there looking pretty. They became massive reservoirs, trapping enormous volumes of water that had previously been part of the ocean system. And when you remove that much water from the oceans, sea levels don't just drop a little, they plummet. For the marine life that had evolved in those warm, shallow seas, this was an absolute disaster. These weren't deep ocean creatures adapted to crushing pressures and eternal darkness. They were shelf dwellers, lagoon swimmers, reef builders who needed sunlit, stable coastal waters to survive. And now those habitats were literally draining away before their eyes. Picture walking along a beautiful coral reef one day, then returning a few centuries later to find it high and dry, exposed to the air and slowly crumbling to dust. Entire ecosystems were left stranded as the water retreated, like marine creatures trapped in tidal pools that never refilled. But the falling sea levels were just the beginning of the problem. The cooling climate was also disrupting ocean currents and atmospheric circulation patterns in ways that cascaded through the entire planetary system. The chemistry of seawater began to change. oxygen levels fluctuated wildly, temperature gradients shifted, creating new patterns of upwelling and downwelling that marine life had never experienced before. And there was another player in this drama that nobody saw coming, high above the receding seas, on land that had only recently begun to support life. Tiny green pioneers were staging their own quiet revolution. Early plants, simple mosses and liverworts, had found ways to cling to damp rocks and soil near water's edge. They were small, humble, easily overlooked, but they were doing something that would change everything. Through photosynthesis, these early land plants were pulling carbon dioxide directly out of the atmosphere and releasing oxygen in return. Now, one little moss plant doesn't amount to much, but multiply that by millions of plants across thousands of years, and you've got a planetary-scale atmospheric engineering project happening in slow motion. As carbon dioxide levels dropped, Earth's greenhouse effect weakened. The warming blanket that had kept the planet temperate for so long began to thin out. Less carbon dioxide meant less heat retention, which meant more cooling, which meant more ice formation, which meant even lower sea levels. It was a feedback loop that fed on itself until the cold wasn't just a phase anymore. It had become Earth's new normal. In this icy world, only the most adaptable marine species had any chance of survival. Some managed to migrate to deeper waters where temperatures remained more stable. Others evolved rapid physiological changes to cope with the new conditions. But for many species, especially those that had become highly specialized for specific habitats or food sources, there simply wasn't enough time to adapt. The fossil record from this period tells a stark story. Coral reefs collapsed entirely. Trilobite populations, which had dominated ocean floors for tens of millions of years, crashed dramatically. Entire lineages of brachiopods and graptolites, creatures that had been the backbone of marine ecosystems, vanished almost completely. By the time the extinction event had run its course, roughly 85% of all marine species were gone. The ocean floor, once buzzing with activity and color, went quiet. The silence preserved in these rock layers isn't just an absence of fossils. It's a wound that's still visible in stone 500 million years later, a reminder of just how quickly a thriving biosphere can collapse when the right combination of factors align. But here's the thing about life that makes this story so fascinating. Even in the midst of this planetary catastrophe, not everything died. Hidden away in the deep ocean, in cold water refuges where conditions remained relatively stable, small populations of marine organisms held on. They weren't the dominant species, weren't the most impressive or complex. They were often the overlooked, the humble, the generalists who could make do with less. These survivors became the seeds of recovery. Soft-bodied worms continued their quiet existence in deep-sea sediments. Early mollusks clung to rocks in the depths. Tiny filter feeders kept processing nutrients from the water generation after generation, maintaining the basic biological processes that would eventually allow marine ecosystems to rebuild themselves. This pattern of survival would repeat itself through every mass extinction in Earth's history. The specialists, the highly adapted, the dominant players often perish when conditions change rapidly. But the generalists, The flexible, the ones living in marginal habitats, they often slip through the cracks and inherit the aftermath. What emerged from the Ordovician extinction wasn't the same ocean that had existed before. The genetic diversity that survived was much narrower, like a library that had lost most of its books, but still retained enough to start rebuilding. This created what scientists call an evolutionary bottleneck, where future life had to pass through this narrow genetic gateway. From that bottleneck came new experiments in living. The survivors didn't just replace what was lost. They evolved in entirely new directions, filling ecological roles that hadn't existed before. Some developed stronger shells and more robust body plans. Others became more mobile, more adaptable to changing conditions. The marine world that emerged from this first great extinction was more resilient than what came before, battle-tested by catastrophe, and deep beneath the waves, in trenches and abyssal plains where sunlight never penetrates, microbial communities continued their ancient work of cycling nutrients and maintaining the basic chemistry of life. These microscopic survivors would become the foundation for everything that followed, the invisible threads that would weave together the next chapter of Earth's biological story. The Ordovician extinction taught life its first hard lesson about planetary scale change. It showed that no matter how successful, how dominant, how perfectly adapted a species might be, the rules of the game can change without warning. But it also demonstrated something even more important: life's incredible capacity for resilience, for finding ways to persist even when the odds seem impossible. As we'll see when we dive into the next extinction event, this pattern of collapse and renewal would become a recurring theme in Earth's history. Each catastrophe would reshape the biological landscape, clear out the old guard, and make space for entirely new forms of life to emerge. The Devonian extinction was already building on the horizon, and it would test life's resilience in completely different ways. As the oceans slowly recovered from their first brush with oblivion, life began experimenting with some truly bold new strategies. The shallow seas were once again alive with movement. Though nothing like the world that had existed before, strange armored fish patrolled waters that had once been empty. New types of reef systems spread across warm coastlines, and along the water's edge, something unprecedented was beginning to stir. This was the Devonian period, often called the Age of Fishes, and it started with incredible promise. Jawed fish evolved into shapes the ocean had never seen before. Some were sleek, predatory torpedoes. Others looked like swimming tanks plated in bone armor. It was an era of evolutionary creativity, with life testing out bold new blueprints beneath the waves. But there was something different about this extinction, something that makes it unique among the Big Five. The Devonian catastrophe didn't arrive like a sledgehammer. It crept in slowly, quietly, like a persistent cough that gradually gets worse over time. Starting around 375 million years ago, this wasn't a single devastating blow, but a drawn-out unraveling that played out over tens of millions of years. At first, you might not have noticed anything unusual. A species here, a species there, disappearing from the fossil record. But over time, The losses started adding up in disturbing ways. The magnificent reef systems that had taken millions of years to establish began showing signs of stress. Fish species, some of the largest and most specialized that had ever existed, started vanishing without any obvious replacements stepping in to fill their roles. The deeper scientists dig into the rocks from this period, the more they uncover these troubling patterns. Dips in biodiversity that signal ecosystem after ecosystem taking hits. And what makes this particularly haunting is that many of these losses were concentrated in the oceans, hitting marine life with a series of body blows that left entire communities reeling. Reef-building organisms took some of the hardest hits. The ancient corals and sponges that had been the architects of underwater cities for millions of years saw their numbers crash dramatically. Trilobites, those armored survivors that had already weathered the Ordovician disaster, began fading again, their long evolutionary success story finally approaching its end. Even the jawless fish that had once been common in coastal waters nearly disappeared entirely. So, what was behind this slow-motion catastrophe? Well, that's where things get really interesting because, unlike the clear-cut ice age that triggered the Ordovician extinction, the Devonian crisis had multiple causes all feeding into each other like a perfect storm of planetary dysfunction. One of the prime suspects is something called ocean anoxia, which is exactly as scary as it sounds. Picture vast stretches of ocean suddenly losing their oxygen, creating underwater dead zones where most forms of life simply can't survive. Fish can't breathe, reefs can't grow, and the only things that thrive are toxic microbes that release poisonous gases as waste products. Evidence for these ancient dead zones is written in the rock record as layers of black shale, sediments rich in organic matter but desperately poor in oxygen. These formations show up across multiple continents from this time period, suggesting that oxygen-starved waters were spreading across ocean floors like an underwater plague. Another piece of the puzzle literally came from the sky. Impact craters dating to this period suggest Earth was getting pelted by asteroids, though nothing as massive as the rock that would later finish off the dinosaurs. Still, even smaller impacts can darken skies, trigger acid rain, and destabilize climates, especially when ecosystems are already under stress from other factors. But perhaps the most surprising culprit in this ancient mystery was something that should have been helping, not hurting. By the middle of the Devonian period, plants had begun their conquest of the land in earnest. What had started as humble patches of moss had evolved into towering forests with deep root systems and stems that reached toward the sun like living skyscrapers. Now, you'd think forests would be good for the planet, right? And in many ways, they were. But these early plant communities were essentially conducting a massive, uncontrolled experiment in planetary engineering, and they didn't always get the results they were hoping for. As forest roots spread and deepened, they began breaking down rocks at an unprecedented rate, releasing nutrients into nearby streams and rivers. Those nutrients then flowed into the oceans, where they triggered massive algae blooms. These blooms might have looked beautiful from space, vast green carpets spreading across the sea surface. But beauty can be deceiving. When these algae blooms died and sank to the ocean floor, they created a biological time bomb. All that decaying organic matter consumed enormous amounts of oxygen as it decomposed, creating exactly the kind of anoxic conditions that were devastating marine ecosystems. It was like dumping fertilizer into a fish tank and watching the whole system crash from oxygen depletion. But the forests weren't done reshaping the planet. Through photosynthesis, these early tree communities were pulling massive amounts of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Now, removing greenhouse gases might sound like a good thing, but remember, this was happening on a world that was still finding its climatic balance after the Ordovician Ice Age. As atmospheric carbon levels dropped, global temperatures began falling again. Ecosystems that had been built for warmth suddenly found themselves dealing with cooling conditions. It's a perfect example of how even beneficial changes can become catastrophic when they happen too fast or at the wrong time. Meanwhile, something amazing was happening at the boundary between water and land. Some fish, equipped with primitive lungs and sturdy fins, were beginning to experiment with brief excursions into shallow pools and muddy flats. Early insects were appearing, along with the first primitive amphibians. This was evolution's first tentative steps onto dry land, a transition that would eventually lead to reptiles, birds, mammals, and ultimately us. But while this terrestrial revolution was just beginning, the ocean was still unraveling. Reef systems that had taken millions of years to establish collapsed entirely. Fish diversity plummeted as specialized species after specialized species vanished from the fossil record. In some regions, the seas grew eerily quiet in places where life had once flourished. What makes the Devonian extinction particularly fascinating is how it demonstrates the interconnectedness of Earth systems. The forests weren't trying to destroy marine ecosystems. They were just doing what plants do, growing and spreading and reshaping their environment. But their success on land had unintended consequences in the oceans, creating a cascade of effects that rippled through the entire planetary system. This pattern of unintended consequences would become a recurring theme in Earth's history. Time and again, the success of one group would inadvertently create conditions that favored entirely different types of organisms. It's like a cosmic game of musical chairs, where the music keeps stopping and starting, forcing life to constantly adapt to new rules. The carbon cycle, once a relatively simple exchange between ocean and atmosphere, now had a third major player, the forest. Weather patterns shifted to accommodate the changing land surface. Rainfall became more seasonal in some regions, more intense in others. Underground, roots continued stirring the earth, breaking down bedrock, releasing minerals, fundamentally altering the chemistry of soil and sea. This wasn't just evolution of individual species anymore. This was the evolution of Earth's entire planetary system, with atmosphere, oceans, and land surface all responding to the life they hosted. And while this new complexity allowed for extraordinary biological innovations, it also made the whole system more vulnerable to disruption. As forests grew taller and root systems deepened, they were unknowingly setting the stage for ecological wounds that would take millions of years to heal. The nutrient runoff from weathering rocks continued feeding algae bloom that consumed oxygen and poisoned waters. The cooling climate added another layer of stress to marine communities already struggling with toxic conditions. Yet even in this slow-motion catastrophe, evolution never completely stopped. It just slowed down and waited, because something even stranger and far more devastating was already building beneath the surface. The stage was being set for the most catastrophic extinction event in Earth's entire history, a disaster so complete it would nearly erase the story of life itself. But that's a tale for our next chapter, because what was coming would make the Devonian crisis look like a minor inconvenience. The great dying was approaching, and when it arrived, it would test life's resilience in ways that had never been imagined. The forests had risen, the oceans had changed, and life had spread across both land and sea. But none of that would prepare the biosphere for what was about to unfold. As we'll discover, the third mass extinction wouldn't just reshape life on Earth. It would bring the entire experiment of complex biology to the very brink of failure, forcing evolution through the narrowest bottleneck it had ever faced. And somehow, incredibly, life would find a way through even that ultimate test of survival. The world that existed around 252 million years ago was unlike anything we can truly comprehend today. Picture a single massive landmass stretching nearly from pole to pole, a supercontinent called Pangaea that brought together virtually all of Earth's dry land into one colossal formation. This wasn't just a geographical curiosity. It was a biological paradise that had taken hundreds of millions of years to construct. Across Pangaea's vast expanses, life had finally hit its stride after recovering from the earlier extinctions. Dense forests hummed with activity as early reptiles navigated through towering ferns and primitive trees. Amphibians lounged along riverbanks in the warm, humid air. The skies buzzed with giant insects, some with wingspans that would dwarf modern dragonflies, taking advantage of the oxygen-rich atmosphere that made such enormous arthropods possible. In the surrounding oceans, diversity had exploded in ways that put previous eras to shame. Coral-like creatures had constructed reef systems of breathtaking complexity. Armored fish shared the waters with squid-like nautiloids and the last surviving trilobites, those ancient arthropods that had somehow managed to persist through every crisis thrown at them. Strange shelled swimmers and early marine reptiles added to the underwater menagerie, creating food webs of incredible intricacy. This was a world that had learned how to flourish after catastrophe. A planet that seemed to have figured out the secret of biological success. For tens of millions of years, this Permian paradise continued to grow more complex, more interconnected, more alive. Evolution was having perhaps its greatest celebration, filling every available niche with weird and wonderful creatures, and then everything ended. Not slowly like the Devonian unraveling, not gradually like the Ordovician ice age. This was something else entirely, a cascade of disasters so tightly linked and so devastating that it earned a name that still sends chills down the spines of paleontologists today. The great, dying, the Permian Triassic extinction, the closest life has ever come to complete and utter failure. The numbers alone are staggering enough to make your head spin. Roughly 96% of all marine species vanished. Not some, not most, but virtually everything that lived in the oceans simply ceased to exist. On land, 70% of all vertebrate species were erased. Entire ecosystems didn't just change, they disappeared completely. The forests withered and fell silent. Even insects, those ultimate survivors that had weathered every previous crisis, faced massive population crashes. For the first and only time in Earth's history, the planet came dangerously close to becoming a sterile rock. The fossil record from this period doesn't show a gradual decline or a series of smaller disasters. It shows a cliff, a sudden drop-off so sharp it looks like someone just erased most of life with a cosmic pencil. So what could possibly cause such complete devastation? What force could be powerful enough to bring an entire planet's worth of life to its knees? The answer takes us to what is now Siberia. But 252 million years ago, this region was ground zero for one of the most violent geological events in Earth's entire history. Picture volcanic eruptions so massive they make modern supervolcanoes look like backyard campfires. But these weren't your typical mountain peak explosions that blow their tops and then settle down. These were flood basalts, where lava poured out through enormous cracks in the Earth's crust like blood from a planetary wound. And it didn't stop. For hundreds of thousands of years, molten rock continued flowing across an area roughly the size of the continental United States. The Siberian Traps, as geologists call this volcanic province today, represented volcanism on a scale that defies imagination. Layer upon layer of hardened lava built up until the landscape was buried under miles of volcanic rock. But the lava itself wasn't the real killer. It was what came with it that turned Earth into a hellish nightmare. Every eruption belched billions of tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, not just once, but continuously, relentlessly, year after year for geological ages. The greenhouse gases built up like a thickening blanket around the planet, trapping heat until global temperatures soared to levels that most life forms had never experienced. Some estimates suggest ocean temperatures rose by more than 10 degrees Celsius in certain regions, a change so dramatic it fundamentally altered the chemistry of seawater itself. But carbon dioxide wasn't the only gas pouring into the atmosphere. The volcanoes also released methane, a greenhouse gas far more potent than CO2. And here's where things get really terrifying. As the oceans warmed from all this atmospheric heating, they began releasing methane that had been locked away for millions of years in frozen crystals beneath the seafloor. This created a feedback loop from hell, where warming caused more methane release, which caused more warming, which released even more methane. The very rain became a weapon against life. Sulfur dioxide from the volcanic emissions mixed with water vapor in the atmosphere to create sulfuric acid, turning precipitation into a corrosive force that stripped leaves from plants, poisoned freshwater systems, and burned through the delicate tissues of any creature unfortunate enough to be exposed. Meanwhile, the oceans were transforming into something that would be unrecognizable today. As more and more atmospheric CO2 dissolved into seawater, The chemistry shifted toward acidity levels that many marine organisms simply couldn't tolerate. Creatures that built shells or skeletons found it increasingly difficult to construct and maintain their protective structures. Coral reefs, which had been the foundation of marine ecosystems for millions of years, began dissolving in the increasingly corrosive waters. But perhaps the most insidious killer was invisible. Some scientists believe the massive volcanic emissions damaged Earth's ozone layer, that thin shield in the upper atmosphere that protects life from deadly ultraviolet radiation. Without this protection, the sun itself became an enemy, bombarding the surface with radiation levels that could sterilize entire ecosystems. Plants that had somehow survived the acid rain and temperature extremes now found themselves vulnerable to their own star's light. Seeds failed to germinate. Photosynthesis broke down. Marine plankton near the surface, those microscopic organisms that formed the base of oceanic food webs, were scorched beyond recovery. All of these factors worked together in a horrifying symphony of destruction. The heat weakened forest defenses. The acid rain stripped away what the heat hadn't already killed. The dying forests released even more carbon into the atmosphere, feeding the very crisis that was destroying them. Ocean food webs collapsed from the bottom up as plankton died off, leaving nothing for larger creatures to eat. What makes this extinction particularly haunting is that it wasn't a single catastrophic moment like an asteroid impact. It was a slow suffocation, a drawn-out planetary fever that lasted for thousands of years. Life couldn't adapt fast enough to keep up with the rapidly changing conditions. Species that had survived for tens of millions of years found themselves suddenly without the environmental anchors they needed to exist. The evidence for this global catastrophe is written in the rocks like a confession carved in stone. Below the extinction layer, you find abundant fossils of reef-building organisms, armored trilobites, and spiral-shelled creatures living in complex marine communities. Above that layer, there's almost nothing, just empty stone where a thriving biosphere used to be. In some places, the seafloor went from rich limestone packed with fossils to barren mudstone with no trace of complex life. The silence isn't just an absence of fossils. It's a wound that's still visible in the rock record 250 million years later. On land, the story is equally stark. Amphibians that had ruled swamps and river systems for millions of years simply vanished from the fossil record. Entire groups of early reptiles disappeared without leaving descendants. Even the insects, nature's ultimate survivors, suffered unprecedented losses. The few species that managed to survive often became dominant simply because there was no competition left. They weren't necessarily better adapted to the new world. They were just the last ones standing in a biological wasteland. This extinction revealed something deeply unsettling about the nature of complex ecosystems. The more intricate and interconnected they become, the more vulnerable they are to cascading collapse. Before the Great Dying, life had built incredibly sophisticated relationships between predators and prey, between different levels of the food web, between marine and terrestrial environments. But this complexity, which had seemed like such an evolutionary triumph, became a liability when the fundamental rules of survival suddenly changed. When oxygen levels in the oceans crashed, it didn't just affect a few species. It brought down entire communities that had depended on stable chemical conditions. When temperatures soared beyond tolerance levels, it wasn't just individual organisms that died. It was the relationships between them, the delicate balances that had taken millions of years to establish. For several million years afterward, the fossil record shows a world struggling to find its footing again. Low diversity, simple food chains, and biological communities that looked more like rough drafts than finished ecosystems. Life had been pushed through an evolutionary bottleneck so narrow that most lineages simply couldn't fit through. But here's the thing that makes this story ultimately hopeful rather than just terrifying. Even in the face of near total annihilation, life didn't give up. Hidden away in the most unlikely places, small populations of organisms found ways to persist. Not the dominant species, not the most impressive creatures, but the humble generalists who could survive on scraps and tolerate extreme conditions. Some were burrowing animals that escaped the worst of the surface chaos by retreating underground. Others were microbes that thrived in the toxic conditions that killed everything else. A few were early relatives of mammals, small opportunistic creatures that could eat almost anything and hide almost anywhere. These weren't the inheritors by right or strength. They were the inheritors by accident, by flexibility, by sheer stubborn persistence in the face of impossible odds. And from this tiny remnant of survivors, evolution would eventually rebuild the entire tree of life, not as it had been before, but as something completely new. The Great Dying wasn't just an ending, it was the most dramatic beginning in Earth's history, clearing away the old order so completely that evolution had to start over almost from scratch. What emerged from this catastrophe would include the ancestors of dinosaurs, the lineage that would lead to mammals, and eventually the branch that would produce us. But that recovery was still millions of years away. First, the planet had to heal from wounds so deep they had nearly killed the very concept of complex life. The stage was being set for something entirely unprecedented in Earth's biological theater. The age of reptiles was about to begin, but only after life had learned its hardest lesson about the fragility of even the most successful ecosystems. The survivors emerging from the Great Dying would be different, more resilient, more adaptable. They had to be, because the world they inherited was unlike anything that had existed before. And as we'll see, their success would eventually pave the way for the next great chapter in life's ongoing story of survival against impossible odds. As the toxic skies finally began to clear and the volcanic fires dimmed to glowing embers, Earth found itself transformed into something barely recognizable. The planet that had once supported such incredible diversity now resembled a science fiction nightmare, with barren landscapes stretching to horizons that had once teemed with life. But in this seeming emptiness, something remarkable was stirring, because here's one of the most incredible truths about evolution. It never truly stops, even when it seems like there's nothing left to work with. In the deepest, darkest corners of this devastated world, tiny pockets of life were quietly preparing for one of the most extraordinary comebacks in planetary history. The creatures that crawled out this apocalypse weren't the impressive giants that had ruled before the great dying. They were small, scrappy opportunists who had survived by being unremarkable. Many were burrowing animals that had escaped the worst of the surface catastrophe by literally going underground. Others were generalists who could eat whatever scraps remained in a world where specialized food webs had completely collapsed. Among these humble survivors were some truly fascinating characters. Early therapsids, distant relatives of what would eventually become mammals, emerged from their hiding places like cautious refugees returning to a bombed-out city. These weren't impressive predators or massive herbivores. They were small-bodied, low-energy creatures with simple dietary needs and an almost supernatural ability to make do with whatever was available. But perhaps even more resilient were the microbial communities that had not just survived, but actually thrived in the toxic conditions that had killed everything else. While complex organisms were suffocating in poisoned seas and acid-scorched landscapes, certain bacteria and archaea were treating these extreme environments like luxury resorts. They could process chemicals that were deadly to other life forms, turning poison into fuel and maintaining the basic biological processes that would eventually allow larger ecosystems to rebuild. This period created what scientists call an evolutionary bottleneck so narrow that it's almost miraculous anything made it through it all. Imagine trying to squeeze the entire diversity of life through a keyhole, and you'll start to get a sense of just how restrictive this filter was. Many entire lineages were lost forever, their evolutionary experiments ending in failure. But the few that survived carried within them the genetic instructions for rebuilding the biological world. And here's where the story gets really interesting, because what emerged from this bottleneck wasn't a pale imitation of what had come before. Evolution doesn't just rebuild, it reimagines. From the scattered remains of early reptile lineages, entirely new dynasties began to take shape. The archosaurs were stirring, that remarkable group that would eventually give rise to dinosaurs, crocodiles, and birds. Think about that for a moment. The mighty Tyrannosaurus rex, those graceful, long-necked sauropods, the pterosaurs that would one day soar through Mesozoic skies. They were all descendants of small, unimpressive reptiles that had once cowered in burrows while the world burned around them. The greatest success story in vertebrate history began not with a roar, but with a whisper of survival in Earth's darkest hour. But even as life began its slow recovery from the Permian catastrophe, the planet wasn't done testing survival strategies. Just as ecosystems were beginning to stabilize and diversify again roughly 200 million years ago, Earth decided to throw another curveball, because apparently one near-total extinction wasn't enough of a lesson in planetary fragility. The Triassic extinction might not have been quite as devastating as the Great Dying, but it arrived at the worst possible time, just as life was finally getting back on its feet after millions of years of recovery. And this time, the cause wasn't Siberian volcanism, but something equally dramatic happening on the other side of the world. Picture the supercontinent Pangaea beginning to crack apart like a massive jigsaw puzzle coming undone. This wasn't a gentle separation. It was a violent tearing that created what would eventually become the Atlantic Ocean. But continental breakup doesn't happen quietly. As the land masses pulled apart, they unleashed volcanism on a scale that, while not quite as intense as the Siberian traps, was still enough to fundamentally alter planetary climate. The Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, as geologists call it today, stretched across what would become parts of North America, Europe, South America, and Africa. For hundreds of thousands of years, lava poured out through massive fissures in the Earth's crust, while volcanic gases built up in the atmosphere like a slow-acting poison. Once again, carbon dioxide and methane levels skyrocketed. Global temperatures soared, while ocean chemistry shifted toward acidic conditions. Acid rain scoured the recovering forests. It was like watching a patient who had just recovered from a near-fatal illness get hit by another devastating diagnosis. Many of the species that had barely survived the Permian extinction now faced their final curtain call. Countless marine reptiles disappeared from the fossil record. Amphibians, which had been slowly rebuilding their diversity, took another massive hit. Even some of the early mammal lineages that had shown such promise were knocked back to the edge of extinction. But here's where this story takes one of its most fascinating turns, because among the survivors of this second catastrophe was a group that had been quietly waiting in the wings for their moment to shine. The early dinosaurs hadn't been particularly impressive before the Triassic extinction. They were just one reptilian experiment among many, neither the largest nor the most successful. But they had something special that became incredibly valuable in a world recovering from catastrophe: versatility. Some walked on 2 legs, others on 4. Some were meat eaters, others preferred plants. They weren't locked into narrow ecological roles like many of their competitors. When the dust settled and ecosystems once again stood empty and waiting, dinosaurs stepped forward to claim the inheritance. Their success wasn't immediate or dramatic. It took millions of years for dinosaurs to truly dominate terrestrial ecosystems. But they had learned something crucial from the extinction events that had shaped their lineage: flexibility. Beat specialization when the rules of survival keep changing. The upright posture that allowed them to move efficiently across varied terrain. The advanced respiratory systems that helped them stay cool in warming climates. The lightweight but strong skeletal structure that made them both agile and resilient. All of these adaptations that would later make dinosaurs the most successful large land animals in Earth's history had their origins in survival strategies developed during times of planetary crisis. By the late Triassic and early Jurassic periods, dinosaurs had become the new architects of terrestrial ecosystems. Large herbivorous species began shaping plant communities through their feeding habits. Predatory dinosaurs maintained population balances among prey species. Their very presence rewrote the evolutionary pressures that other organisms had to navigate. The Earth was now marching to the rhythm of thunderous footsteps and echoing calls that would define the Mesozoic era. But as we've learned from our journey through previous extinctions, success in the biological world is always temporary. Even as dinosaurs reached heights of diversity and dominance that seemed unshakable, the seeds of their eventual downfall were already being planted. Continental drift continued reshaping ocean currents and climate patterns. Sea levels rose and fell in response to changing ice volumes and thermal expansion. New types of plants were evolving, including the first flowering species that would revolutionize terrestrial ecosystems. And high above the atmosphere, in the cold emptiness of space, rocks tumbled through the darkness on collision courses with Earth. The stage was being set for perhaps the most famous extinction event of all, the one that would end the age of dinosaurs and open the door for mammals to inherit the Earth. But before we get to that cosmic catastrophe, it's worth pausing to appreciate just how remarkable the dinosaur success story really was. For over 160 million years, these descendants of small Triassic survivors ruled terrestrial ecosystems with an authority that no group of large animals has matched before or since. They evolved into forms that filled every conceivable ecological niche, from tiny feathered insectivores to massive long-necked herbivores that could browse from the tallest trees. Some became fierce apex predators, while others developed elaborate armor and defensive weapons. They took to the air as pterosaurs and returned to the seas as marine reptiles. They developed social behaviors, complex life cycles, and in some lineages, the beginnings of what we might recognize as intelligence. The Mesozoic world was their world, shaped by their presence and interactions in ways that we're still discovering through fossil evidence. But evolution never stands still, and the same processes that had elevated dinosaurs to dominance were continuing to work in the background. Small mammals were quietly diversifying in the ecological shadows. Flowering plants were forming new partnerships with pollinating insects. Ocean ecosystems were developing new levels of complexity as marine reptiles explored every aquatic habitat, from shallow lagoons to the deepest ocean basins. The biological world of the late Cretaceous period, roughly 66 million years ago, represented perhaps the most complex and diverse ecosystems in Earth's history up to that point. Dinosaurs had created a planetary community of staggering richness, with food webs that stretched from the forest floor to the tree canopy, from freshwater rivers to the open ocean. It was a world in full bloom, humming with life, seemingly invincible in its established success. The great reptilian experiment appeared to have solved the puzzle of long-term evolutionary stability. For millions of years, this biological paradise had weathered smaller environmental changes and continued to flourish. And then, on what might have been an otherwise ordinary day in the late Cretaceous, something appeared in the sky that would change everything. A rock, perhaps 6 to 9 miles wide, moving faster than anything that belonged in Earth's atmosphere, was about to write the final chapter of the Mesozoic era in fire and darkness. But that's a story that deserves its own telling, because what happened next would demonstrate once again that in the grand theater of evolution, even the most successful acts eventually come to an end. The curtain was about to fall on the age of dinosaurs, but as we'll see, every ending in Earth's history has also been a beginning in disguise. The impact that ended the Cretaceous period wasn't just another rock fallen from space. This was a mountain-sized bullet traveling at cosmic speeds, carrying more destructive energy than humanity has ever unleashed, When it slammed into the shallow seas near what we now call Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, it didn't just create an explosion. It rewrote the fundamental rules of existence on Earth in a matter of minutes. Picture this. A chunk of asteroid roughly 6 miles across, hurtling through the vacuum of space at over 40,000 miles per hour. That's more than 50 times faster than a speeding bullet, carrying kinetic energy equivalent to billions of nuclear weapons detonating simultaneously. When it punched through Earth's atmosphere, the air itself caught fire from the friction. The moment of impact defies human comprehension. The asteroid didn't just hit the ground, it vaporized both itself and a massive chunk of Earth's crust, creating temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun. Rock turned to plasma. The ocean boiled and exploded skyward. In the span of seconds, a crater over 100 miles wide and 12 miles deep carved itself into the planet like a cosmic wound that would never fully heal. But the real devastation was just beginning. The force of the collision sent shock waves racing through solid rock faster than sound travels through air. These seismic waves circled the globe multiple times, triggering earthquakes on every continent and awakening volcanoes that had been dormant for millions of years. If you had been standing anywhere on Earth that day, you would have felt the ground shake beneath your feet. Then came the fire. Trillions of tons of pulverized rock and melted debris were hurled into the upper atmosphere, glowing white-hot as they arced through space before raining back down like a hellish meteor shower. This superheated material didn't just fall gently like ash. It re-entered the atmosphere as blazing projectiles that turned the air itself into an oven, igniting global wildfires that consumed entire continents. Imagine every forest, every grassland, every patch of vegetation on the planet simultaneously bursting into flames. The sky filled with smoke and soot so thick that day turned to night across the entire world. But this wasn't the comforting darkness of a normal evening. This was an alien twilight that would last for months, maybe years, blocking out the sun that all complex life depended on. Without sunlight, photosynthesis ground to a halt. Plants couldn't make food. The microscopic marine organisms that formed the base of oceanic food webs began dying in massive numbers. It was like someone had just turned off the power to the entire planetary ecosystem, and the lights were going out one by one from the bottom up. As if the darkness wasn't deadly enough, the impact had also blasted enormous quantities of sulfur-rich rock into the stratosphere. This material combined with water vapor to form sulfuric acid droplets that created a kind of high-altitude toxic fog. When this acid eventually fell as rain, it didn't nourish the scorched earth. It poisoned it further, leaching nutrients from soil and turning rivers and lakes into chemical weapons against any life that had somehow survived the initial catastrophe. The oceans themselves became battlegrounds between chemistry and biology. As atmospheric carbon dioxide levels spiked from all the burning vegetation, more and more of this acid gas dissolved into seawater, fundamentally altering ocean chemistry. Marine creatures that built shells or skeletons suddenly found it nearly impossible to construct their protective armor in these increasingly corrosive waters. Temperature swings added another layer of chaos to an already impossible situation. The initial impact and global fires had heated the atmosphere to unbearable levels, cooking anything that couldn't find shelter. But as the dust and debris blocked out solar radiation, global temperatures plummeted into a prolonged nuclear winter that turned tropical paradises into frozen wastelands. The biological carnage was swift and merciless. The non-avian dinosaurs, those magnificent creatures that had ruled terrestrial ecosystems for over 160 million years, simply couldn't cope with such rapid and extreme environmental changes. Massive herbivores that needed tons of vegetation daily found themselves in a world where plants had stopped growing. Large predators discovered that their prey had vanished along with the food webs that had supported them. But it wasn't just the famous dinosaurs that perished. Marine reptiles like the long-necked plesiosaurs and the massive mosasaurs found their oceanic hunting grounds transformed into toxic dead zones. Flying reptiles called pterosaurs, some with wingspans rivaling small aircraft, saw their aerial domain filled with choking smoke and acid rain. Even the ammonites, those beautifully spiral-shelled relatives of modern squids, finally met their match after surviving every previous extinction event. Yet, in this planetary house of horrors, not everything died. And this is where the story becomes truly fascinating, because survival during the Cretaceous extinction had very little to do with size, strength, or evolutionary sophistication. It had everything to do with being small, flexible, and incredibly lucky. Birds, those feathered descendants of dinosaurs, somehow managed to slip through extinction's narrow doorway. Maybe their ability to fly helped them escape local catastrophes. Perhaps their diverse diets gave them more options when traditional food sources disappeared. Some likely survived in freshwater environments or forested refuges where conditions were slightly less apocalyptic. Whatever the reasons, these small, adaptable creatures carried the dinosaur legacy forward into a very different world. Mammals, too, found ways to endure the chaos. At the time, they weren't the dominant land animals we know today. Most were small, nocturnal insect eaters that lived like furry shadows in a world ruled by reptilian giants. But their modest size, burrowing behaviors, and omnivorous appetites became superpowers in a collapsing ecosystem. They could hide underground when the surface became uninhabitable. They could eat whatever scraps remained when complex food webs disintegrated. Crocodilians also weathered the storm, proving once again that ancient survival strategies sometimes trump modern innovations. These living fossils had already demonstrated their resilience through previous extinction events, and their ability to go months without food while remaining perfectly still in cold water gave them crucial advantages during the long, dark months that followed the impact. What's most haunting about the Cretaceous extinction is how arbitrary survival could be. Some creatures lived simply because they happened to be in the right place when disaster struck. A population of early mammals whose burrows provided protection from the heat and acid rain. A group of birds that found shelter in a valley that escaped the worst of the fires. A community of freshwater organisms that avoided the toxic chemistry changes affecting marine environments. Others died not from the immediate catastrophe, but from the slow unraveling that followed. Species that depended on very specific food sources found themselves in a world where those resources no longer existed. Animals that were too large to hide or too specialized to adapt discovered that their evolutionary advantages had suddenly become fatal liabilities. The thin line between survival and extinction often came down to the most mundane details. Could you eat multiple types of food, or were you locked into a narrow diet? Could you regulate your body temperature internally, or did you depend on external heat sources? Could you reproduce quickly with minimal resources, or did you need stable conditions for complex life cycles? In the aftermath of this cosmic catastrophe, the few survivors found themselves inheritors of a transformed planet. The world that emerged from the darkness was emptier, stranger, and full of opportunities that hadn't existed for over 100 million years. Ecological niches that had been occupied by dinosaurs for eons were suddenly vacant, waiting for new tenants to move in and make them home. And this is where our story takes another remarkable turn, because the small, unassuming mammals that had spent the entire Mesozoic era hiding in the shadows were about to have their moment in the evolutionary spotlight. Freed from the overwhelming presence of dinosaurian competitors, these furry survivors began an adaptive radiation that would eventually reshape terrestrial ecosystems in ways that even the mighty dinosaurs had never achieved. But that mammalian success story was still millions of years in the future. First, the planet had to heal from wounds so deep they had fundamentally altered the trajectory of life on Earth. The age of reptiles was ending, but the age of mammals was just beginning. And as we'll see, this transition would prove that evolution's greatest triumphs often emerge from its darkest moments. The survivors emerging from the Cretaceous extinction carried within them not just the genetic instructions for rebuilding biological communities, but also the evolutionary lessons learned from witnessing the ultimate demonstration of planetary fragility. They had seen what could happen when the rules of survival changed without warning, and they would build the next chapter of Earth's biological story with that hard-earned wisdom coded into their very DNA. From the ashes of the dinosaurs, a new world was about to be born. And in that world, small would often prove to be beautiful. Flexibility would triumph over specialization, and the ability to adapt would become the most valuable trait any organism could possess. The great age of mammals was dawning, but it would be built on foundations laid by creatures who had learned to survive when giants fell. And there you have it, the complete story of Earth's 5 great dying events, each one a testament to both the fragility and the incredible resilience of life itself. From the icy collapse of the Ordovician seas to the cosmic violence that ended the age of dinosaurs, we've witnessed catastrophes that would make our worst nightmares seem like pleasant dreams. But here's the thing that should give us all hope. Every single time our planet got knocked down, life found a way to get back up. Not as the same old thing, but as something completely new, something better adapted to whatever weird world emerged from the ashes. The survivors were never the biggest or the strongest. They were the flexible ones, the generalists, the creatures that could roll with the punches when everything they knew got turned upside down. Today, as we face what many scientists believe is the Sixth Mass Extinction, We're not just observers of this story, we're part of it. The difference is, unlike every creature that came before us, we can actually see it coming. We can study it, understand it, and maybe, just maybe, do something about it. Because if there's one lesson written in stone across 500 million years of Earth's history, it's this. Survival doesn't belong to the dominant. It belongs to the adaptable. And adaptation, it turns out, is